Michael, thank you for agreeing to be here today.
My pleasure.
Can you please speak a little bit about the historical relationship between Israel and Turkey, and particularly highlight some of the recent developments that have changed this relationship?
So Israel and Turkey have been allies and friendly for a long time. Turkey was the first Muslim country to recognize Israel after Israel declared its independence in 1948. And the two countries have always had somewhat of a kin relationship, being that they are two large countries in the Middle East with, well, two large militaries in the Middle East. They're both non-Arab countries. They both have aspirations to be military powers in the region. They are both very close allies of the United States, probably the United States' two closest strategic and military allies in the Middle East. And so there's a natural affinity that exists between Turkey and Israel. And for decades, these two countries had a very close military relationship. And it was a military relationship that was really beneficial to both sides in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of training exercises. And there was a point in the 90s where the two countries had a strong political relationship as well. And these were two countries that really looked to each other in the region, as I said, as somewhat kin countries. And that relationship through Prime Minister Erdogan's first term continued in a strong way. It was somewhat lessened from when the Turkish General Staff had been running things in the 1990s, but there was still a very strong relationship during President Erdogan's first term. When two of the Jewish synagogues in Istanbul were bombed in 2003, I believe it was, Prime Minister Erdogan made a big deal of going to the Turkish chief rabbi's office. It was the first time that a Turkish prime minister had visited a Turkish chief rabbi on the chief rabbi's ground. And this was seen as an effort to show how important Turkey's Jewish community and in line with that, Israel was to Turkey. And so during his first term, the relationship continued in a relatively strong manner. Where things began to break down was during Operation Cast Lead in 2008, when Israel went into Gaza. And Cast Lead came directly on the heels of an Erdogan-led effort to mediate a deal between Turkey and Syria. And Prime Minister Erdogan had been meeting with then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert right before Cast Lead started. And the Israelis did not inform Turkey about Operation Cast Lead. They did not inform the Prime Minister that they were about to go into Gaza. And Prime Minister Erdogan took that very personally and was upset because he had been in the midst of these mediation efforts. And he had expected that if Israel were to do something on the Palestinian front, that he would get a heads up. He didn't get a heads up, and that was really where the relationship started to go downhill. And then there was a famous incident at Davos at the World Economic Forum where Prime Minister Erdogan and Israeli President Shimon Peres were together on a panel, moderated by David Ignatius, who has come up recently in Turkish relations as well. And Prime Minister Erdogan walked off the panel, and his quote to Prime Minister Peres was, "You shouldn't lecture us, you know how to kill very well." And he stormed off the panel. And then in 2010, you had the Marmara Incident, which is what really led to the serious downturn in relations, where, as most people know, a flotilla was coming to break the Gaza blockade. It originated in Turkey. It was 6 ships. The Israelis boarded 5 of them with that incident, but the 6th one, the Marmara, the Israelis boarded, and they were met with resistance, and 9 of the people on the flotilla ended up dying after the Israelis boarded. 8 Turkish citizens and one American citizen who also held Turkish citizenship. And so this was obviously a big deal. And at that point, formal diplomatic relations between the two countries ceased. And Prime Minister Erdogan laid out 3 conditions for relations to get taken up again. They were an apology for the deaths on board the Marmara, compensation for the deaths, and an easing of the Israeli blockade of Gaza. And for between 2010 and March of 2013, really there was a deep freeze. And the rhetorical nastiness between both sides grew. Prime Minister Erdogan used Israel as a convenient punching bag for political purposes. On the Israeli side, Foreign Minister Lieberman used Turkey as a punching bag for political reasons. And so things really spiraled downward pretty quickly. And it wasn't until President Obama's direct personal intervention in March of 2013 when he was in Israel and he stood in a room with Prime Minister Netanyahu and picked up the phone and dialed Erdogan and basically said, hey, I've got Bibi here, here's the phone, you guys should talk. It wasn't until then that things looked like there would maybe be an uptick. In the aftermath of that phone call, the Israelis and the Turks have been negotiating over whether they can really reestablish formal relations. Israel offered an apology during that phone call and reiterated it publicly. But the hang-up right now is over how much compensation the Israelis will pay to the Turks for the 9 deaths. And in a related point, it's what the reason for that compensation is going to be. Whether the Israelis will be able to pay the Turkish families for what they term accidental deaths or an unfortunate incident, or what the Turks want it to be, which is to really take a larger share of the blame and sort of own it. And then you have on the sides you have the Gaza blockade issue, which they haven't even broached. So the formal relationship has really not been reestablished at a high level yet, and I think it's unlikely that we're gonna see a resumption of close ties like we had before. There are strategic reasons why Israel and Turkey should get back together. They include intelligence sharing in Syria and Iran. There's also potential for energy cooperation, which would involve a host of other factors for that to happen, but there's certainly potential given the Israeli natural gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean and the fact that Turkey's current account deficit is driven almost entirely by energy. But there are very strong political forces on both sides that keep this from happening. And particularly on the Turkish side, Israel is still it's a very good campaign issue, as we would say in the US. And so while there are very good strategic reasons for the two sides to get together, I think that the politics have been getting in the way and are going to continue to get in the way.
You mentioned how the United States has always been a present partner in that relationship. Perhaps you can comment, given the recent developments over the past couple of years, how has that impacted the relationship between the United States and Turkey?
The US has a lot of very good reasons for wanting Turkey and Israel to reconcile. As I mentioned before, Turkey and Israel are the US's 2 largest, most well-equipped strategic partners in the region. And particularly when it comes to things like Syria and Iran, it's a big problem for the US when its 2 biggest and closest military allies aren't talking to each other, let alone sharing intelligence at a high level. And so that's a real issue for the US. And for months, if not years, the US was trying to get the 2 sides back together, largely for this reason. I don't think that the rupture in Turkish-Israeli relations is enough of an issue on its own to downgrade US-Turkish relations, but it does come on top of a number of other factors in the US-Turkish relationship that are pushing the 2 sides apart. And so, when you put the Israeli-Turkish rupture and what at this point is seen as really the Turks being the obstacle to the 2 sides getting back together, despite the US's strong request that they do so, when you put that on top of the fact that the US is annoyed at the Turks for allowing foreign jihadi fighters to go into Syria via Turkey, when you put that on top of the fact that the US was not happy about Prime Minister Erdogan's response to the coup in Egypt, where he initially refused to deal with the new Egyptian government, and particularly when you put it on top of the fact that the US right now is very upset about the Chinese missile deal in which Turkey is buying an anti-missile defense system from China rather than from a NATO partner. When you lump all these things together, that's when the rupture between Turkey and Israel starts to have an impact, because it's yet another issue to add to the top of the heap. And of all of those issues, it's probably the one that is the most easily settled, and it's the one that is being driven most by purely political reasons. And so I think it contributes to a growing image in DC that Prime Minister Erdogan is playing politics with a lot of things that he shouldn't necessarily be playing politics with. And so that's where it comes into play. It's certainly not to, I don't mean to downplay the importance of the 2 countries getting together for US purposes, but Turkey is an important country and it's an important ally. And so that by itself is not going to be enough to push the US and Turkey apart. It's when you factor it into everything else that's going on.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.